The Man with the Periwinkle Eyes. Volume 1. Fire and Rain by John Whitberg. Dedication to the 300,000 lost boys of the U.S. Air Force's time travel program at Camp Hero, Fort Worden, the Presidio, and New Orleans. You are not forgotten. Rest in peace. And to all those who made this book possible: Jack Flynn, Catherine Bennett, Bo Mangano, Daniel Sala, Christy Campbell, and all the many others whom I cannot name. Thank you. There is nothing more beautiful or more mysterious than the stars in the sky, and look at us now. We are dancing among them. Debund Proverb. Foreword. Hello all. No doubt there's an interesting story as to how you wound up here, and I hope you'll find this book interesting enough to be worth staying for. A bit of history first, I think, is necessary. Likely this will mostly be review for many of you, but here goes. In 1945, following their defeat in World War II, Germany and Japan made secret deals with certain ET groups, notably the Draco Empire, who agreed to help the former Axis powers build an empire among the stars in exchange for mercenary services. The nations agreed, and thus began a process of war, conquest, and colonization which is ongoing. In 1946, Admiral Richard Byrd initiated Operation High Jump, a U.S. naval expedition to Antarctica. Ostensibly, this was to test military equipment in extreme icy conditions. In secret, it was chasing the Axis powers to their new forward operating base in Queen Maud's Land, Antarctica, known to these Axis powers as New Schwabenland. The U.S. Navy engaged these Axis powers militarily. With their new ET-granted equipment, the Axis defeated the naval aggressors, thereby ending World War II with a decisive Axis victory and beginning a secret Cold War between the Allies on Terra and the Axis-Draco alliance off-world. In summer 1947, a German craft was shot down over Roswell, New Mexico, and stripped by the U.S. Air Force for reverse engineering. Its navigation chair proved to be of particular interest, as it was discovered, through documents on board the ship, to be capable of navigation through space and time, and even into other dimensions. The research into this chair was moved to a newly constructed deep underground military base, or DUM, underneath Camp Hero, also known as Montauk Air Force Station, at Montauk Point, Long Island, New York. Thus began what came to be popularly known as the Montauk Project, though its real name was, and still is, Project Phoenix. The author asks the reader to put a pin in that. In 1952, the secret Cold War escalated. A delegation of German ships flew by the White House in Washington, D.C. One of these ships landed on the lawn of the White House, and the occupants personally approached then-President Harry S. Truman and began negotiations, which continued into the next presidency under Dwight D. Eisenhower, inaugurated in January 1953. A deal was made. 150,000 American children would be given to the Germans, off-world, annually, in exchange for American autonomy being ostensibly respected. This deal is still enforced as of writing this. Due to this, the American government escalated the Cold War with the Axis powers in space. In 1953, the American intelligence community, spearheaded by the Central Intelligence Agency, or CIA, began Project MK Ultra, which used techniques learned from the Illuminati to carry out mind fracture, or the process of splitting the mind into alters, or split personalities. These personalities could then be programmed by the intelligence community for use in secret programs, both on and off planet. The U.S. also began making deals with various ET groups, gaining technology hundreds of years ahead of what the Terran public is allowed access to. The author of this book, myself, John Whitberg, is a survivor of these programs. Like all other survivors, my mind was split into alters, and these alters placed into clone bodies via consciousness extraction. One of these alters was a man by the name of Kyle Delshow, sent to work initially in a program known as Project Ibis, and then in 1984 to the aforementioned Project Phoenix. He was noted for his periwinkle blue eyes. This book is his story. Some housekeeping. Every word of this book is true. While some names have no doubt been changed to protect the innocent, and some truly horrendous events removed to keep this book from becoming misery porn, every event in this book happened, and in the exact way it is recounted. Also of note is that certain popular songs are talked about in a way that is alternative to how they are supposed to have been written. The author is making no claim of copyright, and is therefore not liable for any legal proceedings. For the style of this book, I have chosen a decidedly novelistic style with a journalistic bent, as this seemed the simplest fashion in which to write it being in part a detailed biography and also a historical account. This book is not intended for children or the faint of heart, and should not be read by either such demographics, as it contains profanity, violence, sexuality, Nazism, and upsetting revelations about the nature of our reality, in keeping with the real story it is telling. Survivors of MK Ultra, Project Monarch, Project Phoenix, Project Looking Glass, and any and all other time travel programs, secret space programs, and super soldier programs are advised to take some caution reading this book, as it is liable to be highly triggering. I'm afraid I must also make a rather large request of the reader, and that is that they dispense all notions of linear time, as this quite simply is not applicable to the life of the man whose story is being told. With all that out of the way, please enjoy the ride. Chapter 1. Kyle Delshow walked slowly among the icy rocks, careful not to slip. With the weak gravitational pull, a slip on this moon could mean tumbling off its surface entirely. Reaching a relatively dry and stable spot, he checked the wrist-mounted computer on his spacesuit, gesturing to Lisa Hoffner, his partner for this mission, to stop as well and be seated on one of the rocks, though not to set down the mysterious black metal case they were carrying. Its contents, whatever they were, could not risk being lost. The computer revealed that the pair still had half a kilometer to travel to the coordinates given them. They paused for perhaps 5 minutes, then resolutely set out once again. They saw not a soul on their trek, though in trying not to fall off the face of the moon they walked on, it wouldn't have been difficult to miss a few. They reached the coordinates set for them in good time. At fixed coordinates, they found an indentation in the ground that had obviously been carved by man. Otherwise, nothing marked this spot as special. Kyle and Hoffner glanced at each other, then, with a shrug, Kyle placed the metal case in the indentation. It fit perfectly. Kyle knew they would never receive an explanation for this venture. MI6, particularly the off-planet ops sector, wasn't in the habit of explaining itself to its employees. No sooner had Kyle placed the box in its designated location than Hoffner let out the cry.
"Hostiles, ahead!"
Almost instantly, projectiles began to fly. Kyle ducked behind a rock as he drew his plasma pistol so as to gain a chance to look at their uninvited guests. Hoffner did the same. The hostiles, Kyle could see, wore black spacesuits, unlike the burnt orange ones he and Hoffner wore. He could also see that their suits were more advanced, being more streamlined and tight, allowing freedom of movement, and they appeared to have some sort of anti-gravity levitation system in the boots, which allowed them to perform massive jumps and maneuvers, perfect for this nearly zero-gravity environment. The battle was hopeless. The black-clad assailants numbered at least 10, all armed with rifles, against Kyle and Hoffner, in their much less advanced suits, with only pistols. They didn't stand a chance, but they'd be damned if they didn't try.
"For humanity!"
Hoffner screamed, rising up and blasting her pistol. Kyle did the same. They actually succeeded in taking out 2 of the hostiles. One of them, in response, pulled another weapon, this one also a rifle, but stubby and with a fat barrel. He aimed it up. A grenade launcher, Kyle realized too late. The terrain effectively protected him from the blast itself. Hoffner, however, was not so lucky. Kyle caught a glimpse of her remains being sprayed into space as the impact of the explosion, combined with the debris, sent him flying from where he stood. Somehow he was not sent flying into space, but rather along the icy surface of the moon. He went quite a distance, but unexpectedly regained his footing on a dry spot, after colliding with a rocky outcropping. For a split second, he thought himself safe, until he saw it. There was a pebble or tiny piece of shrapnel lodged in the glass of his suit. It had made a crack, and the crack was spreading.
"Fuck!"
Kyle swore. Was it really going to end this way? He pawed desperately and fruitlessly at his helmet, helpless to stop the spreading of the crack which was leading the glass to its inevitable shattering. I suppose this biography should in earnest begin, as so many do, with a birth. Kyle Delschow was a clone created in a laboratory in the underground facility known as Cheyenne Mountain Complex in 2007. This clone was genetically altered and infused with the DNAs of Draco and Aldebaran Nordic ETs, then as a small embryo sent back in time and placed in a chosen woman's womb as a surrogate. Kyle was born on January 8, 1941, at 2:14 a.m. in Königshütte, Upper Silesia, Germany, now Korzo, Poland. His mother had an affinity for Celtic culture, hence him having the decidedly non-Teutonic name of Kyle. His parents were Helmut Delschow and Irina Delschow, née Kaufmann. Both were avowed members of the Nationalsozialistische Deutsche Arbeiterpartei, better known as the Nazi Party. Due to an asthma condition, Helmut was never sent to the front. The trouble began on a fateful day in December of 1944. Helmut returned from his work early that day, in a clear state of shock.
"Irina,"
he said,
"we must flee."
"Why, dear? And why are you looking in such shock? Do you have such little faith in our Führer? Why, this is our sovereign German territory."
"Yes, it is. But I heard a report today The Russians are killing and expelling Germans, and our government has lied to us. The war is lost.
Neither of them knew that young Kyle had overheard this exchange. Helmut's words proved true. Within days, German expellees from the east began arriving in Königshütte, some in vehicles, some on horseback, but most of all on foot. They brought with them stories of massacres and mass rapes and reprisals. This prompted many Königshütte residents to begin making preparations for flight into the Reich interior. Due to being owners of a store, the Delschaus had to spend several days liquidating their assets. It was clear, by late December 1944, that it was unlikely they would be coming back. A plan was hatched to send young Kyle away ahead of them. One of the local schools had arranged an evacuation by train of a group of German children to be taken by train to Berlin. Irina Delschau had a sister in the city, Miss Johanna Kaufmann. Arrangements were made for her to pick Kyle up at the station and care for him until the Delschaus arrived. Whether any of these parties knew what was to happen, it's unlikely we shall ever know. The train from Königshütte to Berlin on December 21st, 1944, one of the very few remaining passenger trains still running, was at capacity with refugees. In fact, it was beyond it, as a number of persons had bribed the conductor to allow them to be seated in the bathrooms, galley, and luggage car. A group of soldiers were assigned to oversee the boarding, to ensure that women and children passengers were given priority. The sounds of the Russian front approaching could already be heard from the outskirts of town. However, even then, there was still propaganda being disseminated of a Nazi redoubt in the Sudetenland. Those who believed it still did not flee. Kyle was approaching the train. One of his hands was held by the woman of the couple overseeing the group of children. His other hand was held by his mother, who was holding on to his father. It was not until the doors of the carriage opened and the cry of "all aboard" went out that Kyle realized he had lost hold of his mother's hand. He turned to look as he was ushered onto the train, to see that his parents had both been lost in the sea of people on the platform. Never did he ever see them again. As the train rolled on, the war increasingly became a topic of conversation among the train's passengers. Talk of reprisals against the Russians was oft discussed, and other such fantasies. Also discussed was the housing crisis inside Germany, which had already begun, due to bombings. Many refugees seemed to have no idea where they were intending to go, as their lives were all outside of Germany proper. The train departed Königshütte at 10:46 a.m. At about noon, it stopped in a small village to refuel, as it had already come quite a distance. When the noise of the engine stopped, one could easily and plainly hear numerous German, American, British, and Russian planes flying overhead. There was considerable apprehension as to if these planes would pick an easy target and bomb a sitting train. Eventually, as the passengers waited, a conductor came into the car.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are asking all passengers to disembark for some hours. We have received word that they are having to lay new rails up ahead as the old ones were bombed. Please disembark and have some refreshments in the station.
That's it?
Demanded one woman.
We'll be next.
A number of passengers simply abandoned their luggage, deciding to continue on foot. The couple leading the evacuation of the children from Königshütte discussed the possibility, but it was decided that they would wait for the train. The group had been waiting in the station for a number of hours when 2 SS personnel entered the station. One very tall man, with jet black hair and piercing blue eyes, and a smaller strawberry blonde woman, both in SS uniforms with quite a number of medals visible. The 2 SS personnel approached the group of children. The older children and the couple leading them all stood and saluted them. The SS man produced a clipboard.
I am here to collect
He squinted at the name.
Kyla Delschau.
Kyle noticed that he pronounced it as Kyla. The woman of the couple leading the children approached the SS personnel.
I and my husband represent him. What is your business here?
She asked.
He is a child in this group. Then I'm afraid you must produce him. We are here to collect him. Business of the state,
Replied the SS woman. By that point, young Kyle had stood and moved closer to the SS man, as he had known his parents would expect him to do. Despite his intimidating appearance, he had a kind demeanor, and smiled at the young boy as he approached. In spite of the obvious apprehension of the couple in charge of the children, Kyle was soon escorted out and loaded into the back of a large black car. The SS woman drove, while the man sat in the back to entertain Kyle. It was by then close to nightfall. The trio drove for hours through Germany. The signs of war were obvious. The SS man attempted to keep Kyle distracted from these sights. Whether this was to spare Kyle's feelings or simply to save face by hiding the obviously desperate situation, we shall never know. A note of potential importance. The SS man had the surname of Kramer, while the SS woman had the surname Messerschmitt. I include this info on the off chance that some readers will be inclined to check some archives for any potential information on them. Eventually, exhausted by the day, Kyle fell asleep. He was awoken by a light shining into his face. The car had reached a checkpoint just outside the city of Dresden. This was in late December of 1944, less than 2 months before the infamous bombing of Dresden, which occurred on February 13th, 1945. As a result, the beauty of the city was still very evident. It was by now the dead of night. It seemed that electricity was being rationed, as not even the street lights were on. The only lights came from the few cars on the streets, and the occasional gaslight in the windows of a few homes and apartments. The car eventually pulled into a small blind alley off a side street. It rounded several corners in this alley, to a portion where it was quite invisible to the outside world, except possibly from the roofs of the then empty industrial buildings that made up this district. The trio then disembarked from the vehicle. The SS woman, Messerschmitt, glanced at her watch.
We are early, Jürgen,
She said to Kramer.
German punctuality, my dear. German punctuality,
Was Kramer's reply. Young Kyle tapped the SS man on the back and then motioned to him that he had a need to make water. The man and boy stepped around a corner out of sight of Ms. Messerschmitt to do this. It was as they returned that they were greeted by a flash of brilliant blue light against one of the walls of the alley. The light formed into an oval shape, perhaps 7 feet, 2.13 meters in height. The oval very suddenly became hollow and showed it wasn't a light at all, but a portal that had opened. Messerschmitt glanced at her watch once again.
They are early too,
She said.
German punctuality, my dear. German punctuality.
Kramer once again replied. It was becoming a running joke. Young Kyle was not at all frightened. Rather, he was curious. The portal had a blue mist over its body, through which one could just make out the picture that lay beyond, of what appeared to be a warehouse, with a manned desk also visible just beyond a downward slope.
Well, we've come all the way from 28 years from now. Let's not disappoint,
Messerschmitt remarked.
Come now, young Kyler,
commanded Kramer, taking the boy's hand. With curiosity, and perhaps by now a touch of trepidation, Kyle took the man's hand, as he knew his parents would want him to do, and the trio walked to and through the portal. He perhaps knew, even at that young age, and with extreme naivete, that his life would be forever altered. What he didn't know, but soon would, was what would greet him on the other side of the portal, Project Ibis, and all that it implied. Author's note. The reader may, upon reading this, be inclined to detect a certain sympathy by the author on behalf of the Nazi regime and its territorial claims. This is the opposite of the case. I am telling these historic events as seen through the eyes of one German boy who was not quite yet 4 years old. Nothing more and nothing less. Chapter 2. For the reader, a brief history of Project Ibis is likely necessary, as it is quite often misrepresented in the existing body of information. Project Ibis was created in 1972. It was a project to usher in a Fourth Reich. Created by a group of perhaps 20 Project Paperclip Nazis who, through their connections, managed to acquire for themselves a Stargate portal generator, a cybernetics and gene modification laboratory, and a set of technologies which could scan souls. Any questions remaining in the reader's mind will hopefully be answered as the narrative of Kyle's life continues. Now let's return our attention to it. Kyle's feelings upon arrival are difficult to describe. He still did not feel fear. He had no reason to, yet. As a 6-year-old born into war, his only real fears at that time were guns and bombs, neither of which was evident. His emotions were dominated rather by confusion. Confusion as to what he had just witnessed, and even more, confusion as to what was happening. The sights upon entering through the portal were fairly nondescript. The portal opened onto a small concrete ramp. Looking at the device, one simply saw a huge metal oval with wires running into the concrete floor. Just beyond the ramp was a rather large white metal desk with a single man seated behind it. 2 guards in Waffen-SS uniforms stood on either side. All this was housed in what looked like an enormous windowless warehouse that appeared to be otherwise empty. The man at the desk barely glanced up as the trio of Kyle Kramer and Messerschmitt entered.
Take the boy to processing,
he said, gesturing vaguely to his left. Young Kyle did not understand this order at the time as the man spoke English. He was then led to one end of the warehouse. So enormous was it that the walk was tiring. Upon reaching what appeared to be a standard industrial fireproof door, the 2 SS stepped up on either side. It was then that Kyle noticed 2 silver boxes with slits mounted on the wall. He stared in wonder as the 2 SS personnel stood on either side of the door and held their eyes up to the slits in the boxes. Then a few seconds later, the fireproof door opened, seemingly on its own. It was Kyle's first encounter with the technology known as retinal scanning. Beyond the door was like night and day. The industrial scenery ended at the threshold and instantly transitioned into a sterile, futuristic clinic type of environment. Long hallways of pure white and chrome. The only spark of color Kyle could see was one wall adjacent to him, which was dominated by a Nazi flag. He did take slight comfort in this familiar sight. The trio reached the end of a hallway when a door opened. A man emerged. It was at the sight of this man that Kyle instantly felt his first wave of real terror. He no longer felt safe. He wanted in that moment, more than anything, to go home. Back to Königshütte. Not anywhere near this clearly American man who exuded evil. The man was tall. He fairly towered over all those around, or at least it seemed so to Kyle. He looked more than anything like a vampire. Tall and thin, his bright white skin casting an eerie contrast against his soulless black eyes. He wore a full SS uniform. The man was, as it would transpire, Commander Michael Aquino. He beamed at the sight of Kyle, then turned his attention to the two SS escorting the boy.
"He is intact,"
he inquired in flawless German.
Of course, Herr Kommandant,
replied Messerschmitt, with the slightest tremble detectable in her tone.
"Splendid."
He kneeled down to young Kyle.
"We're going to make you glorious,"
he said, with an almost demonic gleam in his black, unfathomable eyes. Aquino took Kyle's hand and led him into the room he had stepped out of. The two SS personnel departed. Kyle never saw Messerschmitt again. However, Kramer went on to become a permanent fixture of Project Ibis. Upon entering the room, Kyle was greeted with the strangest sight he had ever seen. So strange that it seemed difficult to believe it was physically real. Two crocodilian humanoids, each in Nazi uniforms and holding railguns, stood on either side of the room. In the center was what resembled a dentist chair, with a large projection screen behind it. At the sight of the humanoid crocodiles, Kyle was awash in fear. He screamed and turned towards the door, but his escape died before it was even born. Aquino grabbed his collar and dragged the terrified child across the room and placed him in the chair. He instantly struggled to rise.
"Stay in the chair,"
the commander ordered.
"No, I want to go home."
Aquino slapped the young boy in the face.
"Are you deaf? I said, stay in the fucking chair,"
he screamed. Kyle continued to resist. The two reptilian guards walked to him. As one of them bent over him to strap him in, it spoke to him in his mind.
"Remain calm,"
the crocodile man cautioned.
"It ends quicker when you don't resist."
Kyle caught a note in this telepathic voice, one of a certain shared fear. This reptile man, wherever he had come from, was a prisoner too. At this revelation, Kyle calmed down. The chair was raised to a sitting position, and Kyle's head secured to the headrest. He then noticed that the wall ahead of him had been replaced by a huge mirror. In the commotion, someone must have slid it into place.
"Watch above your head,"
Aquino instructed. Kyle obeyed. He watched in bewilderment as one of the reptile guards produced from behind the chair a gold pyramid, perhaps 18 inches in height, the top 4 inches of which were occupied by a single enormous crystal. One of the guards placed the mysterious device atop Kyle's head. Almost immediately, the crystal lit up. A few seconds later, the pyramid lifted itself above Kyle's head and levitated, then began to spin. As the spinning began, Kyle was overcome by a strange sensation, as though the device was pulling himself out of his own body. The spinning stopped after perhaps 15 seconds. Then the purpose of the projection screen became obvious. Out of the crystal and onto the projection screen, a series of images, like a haphazardly spliced film, began to be visible. All the images were unfamiliar to Kyle. Images of non-human creatures, images of space flight. They sped by so quickly that he could not see details. Not until it reached a certain set of images of a crocodile man, larger than the 2 guards in the room.
Stop!
Aquino demanded in English. The device paused. It was held on an image of the crocodile man. This one, unlike the brown specimens in the room, was dark green, perhaps 15 feet in height. It had very obvious muscles and wore a loincloth.
That was once you, my boy, and will be you again. Sobek,
said Aquino. Kyle was bewildered, but he was already learning not to question his tormentor. At this point, Aquino walked to where the boy sat in the chair and removed the device from where it was still levitating in midair above the 3-year-old's head. After placing it on the ground again, he walked to the door and spoke into an intercom that was adjacent to it.
Send in the guards. The boy is ready,
he ordered in English. 2 guards, these apparently human, entered the room. Both men, and both wearing green Waffen-SS uniforms while carrying railguns. The 2 men approached the chair and unrestrained the young boy. He breathed a long sigh at what he thought was now freedom. However, his relief was short-lived indeed. Immediately after releasing him from the confines of the chair, the 2 guards began pulling his clothes off. Kyle resisted, but it was futile. From somewhere, one of the guards produced a new set of clothes, a pair of white skin-tight pants, a matching straitjacket, and a leather collar with a strip of metal on the inside. Into these, young Kyle was dressed. After being bound, the 2 guards grabbed Kyle. Each took one arm, and they carried him away. They passed through a bewildering labyrinth of hallways, each one virtually identical to the last. All the doors were closed, and they passed very few other people, all of whom were dressed in either Nazi military or medical uniforms, and none of whom acknowledged the trio as they passed. After what seemed like an eternity, the trio reached a hallway of rooms visibly smaller, judging by the space between doors, than most of the others. These doors had number plates on them. The door to number 16 was opened, and the 2 carrying young Kyle entered.
Welcome to your new home,
one of the guards said, sarcastically. The room was rather small. On one wall was a small toilet. Set just beyond it, and taking up most of the room, was a most unusual cage. It was wooden and stood on legs about a foot off the ground. It looked more like an oversized crib than a traditional cage, except that the top was enclosed. After permitting Kyle to briefly use the toilet, one of the guards threw open the top of the cage. Kyle was placed inside. After closing the top, the 2 guards unceremoniously left, closing the door behind them. The room was instantly bathed in complete darkness. Now utterly exhausted, Kyle fell asleep. He came to when the room was bathed in blinding white light. He sat bolt upright and attempted to get to a standing position, but was stopped by the straitjacket. There was apparently a loudspeaker somewhere, as a disembodied voice was soon heard coming into the room.
"Please look to the end of the crib,"
the voice said in German. Kyle did so. At the end of the crib was a small screen, perhaps 12 by 7 inches. 2 images appeared, one of a nude man, the other of a crocodile. Kyle did not know this, but the man pictured was in fact himself as an adult.
"Merge the 2 pictures,"
the voice then commanded. The young boy was confused, not knowing the meaning of the word merge, or rather verschmelzen, as the voice, that clearly of a large man, was speaking German with a rather prominent Viennese accent. Unsure what he was meant to actually do, Kyle stayed still. At Kyle's inaction, the disembodied voice sighed. Instantly after, he was overcome by a terrible burning, shocking sensation in the neck. The muscles in his neck seized to where he could not breathe. He began to see spots. He collapsed hard against the side of the crib. The collar he wore, he would later learn, was the source of the shock.
"I said, combine the images,"
the voice stiffly yelled. With the use of the more familiar word, kombinieren, Kyle understood what was expected. Using the crocodile men he'd already seen as his guide, he began attempting to merge the 2 images mentally into something resembling them. To his surprise, the images on the screen also began to change on the lines as his mind was envisioning them.
"Good boy. Keep that up. That's it,"
the voice said. Eventually, the 2 images combined to the degree that on the screen was a crocodile man, very similar indeed to the one the pyramid had projected earlier.
"Hold,"
the voice commanded, and Kyle held. A few seconds later, a message flashed on the screen in English.
"Facsimile complete. Avatar creation initiated."
Of course, Kyle could not read this at all at the time. What he also did not know was that this ordeal was all merely the first of many steps of initiation into his new life. Author's note. And so it begins, I suppose. I realize not much has been explained yet. The reader is asked to have patience and to understand that some questions may still be unanswered by the end, since all this information is retrieved from conscious recall. Chapter 3. The next phase was one of programming. It seems to have been, at least to an extent, customized to each child. Kyle's specific programming will be described in the following. After the merging of the images, Kyle's room was returned to darkness. With no warning, he soon fell asleep again. An unknown period of time later, the door opened. Once again, 2 guards entered. Once again, both wore Waffen-SS uniforms. Neither spoke a word as they opened the crib and lifted the young boy out, removed his straitjacket, and placed him instead in a white undershirt. He had clearly been in the dark room asleep for quite some time, as he found it rather difficult to move his limbs again. After redressing Kyle, the 3 entered the hallway and turned right.
"Walk forward, now,"
one of the guards ordered, and so he did. They walked for a considerable distance through more long hallways, with a guard always directing with his nightstick where to go. Eventually, they reached a room that was different from the rest. It had an entrance of 2 sliding glass doors. Kyle was marshaled inside. The room was huge and long. Inside were 2 rows of what looked like low-lying autopsy tables. Each child had been strapped onto one. then equipped with a helmet and what appeared to be a pair of opaque black goggles. Both of these devices had an enormous tangle of wires coming out of them, which connected to a black box placed on the floor at the head of each table. At the foot of each table was a plastic plaque with the name of a deity from the Egyptian pantheon: Isis, Horus, Sekhmet, Apophis, and so on. Kyle could not yet read these. There were easily over 100 of these tables, though less than 20 were occupied. At the furthest end of the room was a long desk with perhaps 15 computer stations on it, all of them manned at that moment. Aside from the personnel at the computers, about 10 other personnel were milling about, all in SS uniforms of varying rank, save for one brunette female doctor in scrubs and a white lab coat. The nearest table to Kyle was occupied by a brown-skinned girl, with a plaque on the end of her table reading, Isis. Partly out of concern, and partly out of curiosity, he reached out and poked the girl. She did not stir. He poked again, and as he did so, was greeted by the feeling of a jackboot being slammed into his head, causing him to fall to the ground on his face. He looked up to see one of the SS men, who had obviously kicked him.
Keep your filthy hands to your fucking self, you little shit!
The man sharply screamed the words. Kyle began to cry, realizing truly the ordeal he was in. And why, he wondered, was this all happening? He wanted in that moment only to return to Königshütte and his normal life.
Language, my good sir. And now you've possibly damaged my subject. Great job.
The reprimand came this time from a female voice, speaking English.
And so might have he, Dr. Krieger,
the guard replied. From his position on the floor, Kyle saw the approach of the doctor. She was quite tall and quite conventionally attractive, with reddish-brown curly hair that hung just past her ears and large hazel eyes. She wore blue scrubs and a pair of sensible black Oxfords on her feet.
Your concern is most appreciated,
she said to the young SS man.
Now, if that will be all, officer.
She squinted at the name pinned to his lapel.
Hos, you are dismissed. You will now please leave my subjects unmolested, if it's not too much trouble.
With a look of obvious perturbation, the SS man Hos turned away. Dr. Krieger bent down to the bundle that Kyle had formed on the floor and brought him to his feet.
Come now, young sir. We must not let them get to us, must we?
She said, in perfect German. The doctor's no-nonsense attitude reminded Kyle of his father and served to calm him somewhat. The doctor led the boy through the room to one of the low-lying metal tables. This one had a number painted at the head on the side, number 32, and the plastic plaque at the foot bore the name Sobek. Aquino walked by. This time, he happened to be wearing a name tag, reading Commander Aquino. Kyle took note of it instinctively, in spite of being unable at that moment to know what it said. The doctor lifted the helmet and its attached goggles and placed them on Kyle's head. There was nothing visible at that time, just blackness. He heard the woman snap her fingers, and immediately a set of large male hands were lifting his feet, while the doctor gently lowered his head and shoulders onto the table. Compared to the violent treatment he had been subjected to, he found it quite refreshing, though it was likely more for the benefit of the expensive equipment than his personal comfort that it happened. Next he felt his hands and feet being pulled into a spread eagle position, then restrained there, then further constraints being placed across his body. He felt his arm being rubbed with something cold and wet, then the unmistakable sensation of an enormous needle stabbing his arm and injecting a thick liquid. He whimpered at the pain, but was learning quickly to not complain. What he did not know at the time was that the injection consisted of nanites designed to enhance him for the experience that he was about to undergo. Several minutes passed.
It should be set in by now, Doctor.
He heard someone say in English. To his shock, he now understood what was said. An image came over his eyes, a young woman standing in front of a blackboard. She began to speak. This was a virtual reality learning program. Due to spotty memory on my behalf, most details are unknown. However, there were approximately 100 such sessions, each lasting about 6 hours. All the IBIS children underwent this programming. By the end, they were fully equipped to read, write, speak English and German with native-level fluency, and had a basic understanding of combat medicine procedures, as well as Nazi beliefs. The nanites they were injected with served to increase their IQ to well above the average human and expanded the capacity of their personal memory banks. Further programming was eventually carried out at the hands of Commander Aquino and his wife, Lilith. This programming consisted of abuse of a ritualistic nature. For legal reasons, and to avoid causing undue trauma to the reader, I am sparing the details. Those still determined to know are suggested to consult the large body of work which has already been written on the subject. Once again, during this time, no interactions were allowed between the IBIS children. The children also began to receive cybernetic enhancements. This included an in-the-brain antenna to amplify telepathy, third-eye implants to maximize remote viewing, and further nanites to enhance strength. Eventually, perhaps 4 months after Kyle had arrived, all the currently present children were brought into the warehouse-like space from which they had entered. In the intervening time, it had filled up. Enormous shipping crates, some opened, could be seen. There was also a huge typing pool, a set of file cabinets, and one portion had been transformed into a makeshift classroom. It was to this section that the children were directed. Kyle took in the scene. There were easily 500 child-sized desks. However, by his head count, only 42 were occupied. Each had a nameplate with both the child's name and the name of the Egyptian god they had come to be associated with. Kyle eventually found the one which was labeled Kyle Delschau Sobek and took his seat there. Each had a nameplate with the name. Once all were seated, a man stood from his desk which faced the front of this makeshift classroom. Kyle recognized him as the SS man Kramer, who had escorted him here at first. Behind him, clearly not intending to be seen, was another man. He was also in full SS regalia, with so many medals that it made one wonder how his clothes withstood all the extra weight. He looked perhaps 65, Kyle surmised, with short-cropped gray hair and a rather prominent scar on his left cheek. His name tag bore the name of Emmerman. Kramer spoke.
Boys and girls, this is a momentous day. This is pairing day. Today you will all bond in avatar form with your chosen pair. Their names will be distributed presently.
An SS girl began making the rounds through the room, placing a piece of paper on each desk. Kyle picked up and read his. It had Elsa Tyler, Wadjet, printed on it. Kyle realized this must be his pair. No sooner had the group read the names printed on the pieces of paper given to them than Kramer instructed them all to stand and follow him. The group did so, on yet another long march through identical hallways, until they reached a room labeled Avatar Repository and entered. The room was tremendous in size. The floor was concrete and smooth. Before them, the group could see quite easily a small city's amount of cylindrical glass tubes, in groups of 3, stretching out before them. It was then that Kyle realized that this place must be using some form of technology to create rooms which were larger on the inside than out. Dr. Krieger emerged in front of the group of children.
Welcome to your new home away from home, the Avatar Lab. See these tubes behind me? These are your avatars. One is your adult form, the other a copy of your associated God form. The third tube is empty for you to use. Please find yours, and our technicians will then assist you from there.
Kyle found his without much difficulty. He stared in awe at his 2 avatars. One was of a man, 6.5 feet tall and handsome. The other of a crocodile man, over twice that height. Both were totally nude and immersed in a translucent green fluid, which the empty cylinder was also filled with. Next to the 3 cylinders was a stationary computer terminal with a technician seated at it. The technician at Kyle's set of tanks looked up as he approached. He walked Kyle to the backside of the machinery, where Kyle observed that a handy stepladder had been placed that led to the top of the empty tank. He also noticed, hovering just above it, a human-shaped metal frame in a spread eagle position, with a hydraulic arm connecting it to the ceiling. The technician, a petite, dark-haired man with glasses, then instructed Kyle to remove all his clothes and leave them in a bundle at the base of the stepladder, then to ascend it and enter the metal frame. Upon entering the frame, the hydraulic arm lifted it up to the top of the empty cylinder, then lowered Kyle and the frame into the cylinder. Kyle noticed that the fluid was thick, almost gelatinous. He instinctively held his breath upon entering. Though the fluid was so viscous, he probably could not have breathed it, even if he had tried to do so. Instantly, upon being immersed, he was overcome with a feeling of sleepiness he couldn't resist. When he came to, he realized that he was being lifted from the cylinder by the hydraulic device. He looked down and realized he was now inhabiting the adult human avatar. The child's body he had always known was in the cylinder to his left. Even more surprising to him was that he was not having any difficulty in animating it. It felt totally natural. The fluid ran off his skin like water off a duck's back, leaving nothing behind save for a trace of moisture. Upon being lowered to the floor, the technician handed Kyle a robe. It was white, only barely big enough for Kyle to cover his decency, and there was no way to tie it. The technician also produced a paper and handed it to Kyle. A study of it revealed it was a map to a wing labeled housing. Kyle proceeded to follow it. He was met in the hallway by others in their adult avatars, all men at that point, and all following the same map. Upon reaching this wing, they discovered it to be a collection of numbered rooms. A woman was waiting for them. The men all attempted, sheepishly, to cover their decency when they saw her, though she clearly had no interest, as she silently went around and handed each man a key with a number tag on it.
Gentlemen, welcome to your new homes. You will be housed here when you are an avatar. In your child bodies, you will be kept in your usual cage housing.
Kyle's stomach sank at the notion of having to return to a child's body, and the cage it was kept in, just as he was beginning to feel freedom in his newfound adult body that could flatten most people who might give him grief. The men soon found their rooms using the keys they had been given. Kyle entered his with some trepidation, but felt a massive wave of joy over his body when he did. The room was large, about the size of a hotel room, with a proper bed, the first he had seen since leaving Königshütte. The bed was huge, nearly 20 feet in length.
To accommodate my Sobek body,
he realized suddenly.
Welcome, Sobek.
A female robotic voice said into the room's intercom as the door shut behind him.
Danke.
Kyle replied automatically, wondering whom he was thanking even as he said it. Kyle walked up eagerly to the most shocking sight in the room. The upper half of an entire wall that was taken up by a huge plate glass window, with a mountain landscape visible in it. It was with some disappointment that he realized it was a television screen. Still, it was his first glimpse of nature in the months since he had arrived from Königshütte. Kyle was still examining the landscape when he heard the door into the room open and close behind him. He turned to see a woman, also scantily clad in an ill-fitting robe, standing in the doorway. She was tall, though a good deal shorter than Kyle was. She had shoulder-length black hair. Her most notable feature to Kyle was her eyes, which were a deep purple.
Welcome, Wajet,
said the robotic voice on the intercom. After several minutes of each party trying in vain to conceal their bodies in the inadequate robes, they finally gave up, and each extended their right hands to one another.
Elsa Tyler,
the woman said. Then after a pause, she added,
Wajet.
Kyle Delschau, Sobek.
Kyle replied. As their eyes met, they both felt an urge to examine each other's bodies. As they did so, their bodies began to respond in a certain way, likely aided by the nanites they had received and the new rush of adult hormones they weren't used to. Had they been paying attention, they'd have likely noticed the faintest scent of pheromones being vented into the room. It was then that Kyle and Elsa realized, if only subconsciously, what was meant by pairing. They both instinctively moved towards the bed. Nature, if it may even be called such, took its course. In the following few days, all the IBIS members were given SS uniforms of the lowest rank, then summoned again to the makeshift classroom in the warehouse area. They were given a list which was the unit they were assigned to. Kyle's unit was as follows: Kyle Delschau, Sobek; Elsa Tyler, Wajet; Roger Clément, Horus; Sandra Lau, Hathor; Joseph Fair, Apophis; Sienna Sinclair, Matt; Joey Streicher, Konsu. Their stories will proceed in the following chapters. Author's note: some readers may feel I have been too soft or censorious and should have included detailed descriptions of the abuse suffered by the children. This book is not torture porn. A huge body of work on the subject of ritual abuse already exists, which the reader may consult if they wish. Chapter 4. I suppose the first step is to give the reader a better idea of each of the members of Kyle's unit. Elsa Tyler was a British girl by birth, though at a DNA level she was a test tube baby, made by combining the DNA of the embryo she had been conceived as with the DNA of both Naga reptilian ETs and of a humanoid species from the constellation of Cassiopeia, which is what led to her having purple eyes. Her past life was as the Egyptian warrior goddess known as Wadjet, a snake with a humanoid upper body. This is the species which is most commonly known as Naga. Her personal specialized skills were sniping and the very delicate art of persuasion. Roger Clément was born in France, to an African-French father and a German-French mother. He was also a test-tube hybrid baby, created by the Direction Générale de la Sécurité Extérieure, or in English, Directorate General for External Security, or DGSE, the French equivalent to the CIA. His exact hybrid status is unknown to the author. His past life was as Horus, the falcon god. In reality, an alien species from uncharted deep space with a roughly humanoid body with avian features resembling a falcon. His personal specialties lay in the direction of assassination with blades and close quarters combat. He was paired to Sandra Lau Hathor. Sandra Lau was Chinese-American, born in Hong Kong, but moved with her parents to New York City as an infant. Her past life was as Hathor, a sky goddess, who was in reality a member of the alien race commonly known as the Anunnaki, and by some as the Tall Whites. These are a human species that range from 12 to 15 feet tall, wraith-like, and with very pale skin. They originate on a planet known as Nibiru, which lies beyond the Oort cloud, and are known to have massive amounts of influence in the affairs of Earth. Sandra Lau was valued for incredible remote viewing abilities and uncanny skill with speedy and accurate memorization of numerous languages, both human and otherwise. Josef Fair was another test-tube baby, created from a human German father, mixed with a huge array of alien races, and born from an artificial womb on Mars. His past life was as Apophis, a god of chaos. In reality, a Naga, the same species as Elsa Tyler, Wadjet. Joseph was valued as an all-around killing machine, and for his diplomatic skills for relations between different species. He was paired to Sienna Sinclair, Mott. Sienna Sinclair was of unknown origin, though she was known to be a member of a powerful German family off-world, and set to inherit her family's empire. Her past life was as another Anunnaki, the goddess of wisdom known as Mott. She was valued for her psychokinetic abilities, particularly pyrokinesis. Joey Streicher, real name Joseph, altered here to avoid confusion with Joseph Fair, was a German national and also a clone, born as a surrogate to two British parents. Other details are lacking. His past life was as the moon god Khonsu. Of note is that the true history of Khonsu has been buried. For one thing, he was misrepresented as having the head of a bird to associate him with an avian species, when in reality he was a hybrid between humanoid and reptilian. He is also most often shown as the son of Amun and Mut, when in reality he was the son of Sobek and a humanoid Tau Setian woman who has been wiped from all records. Joey's skills were in the field of interrogation. Immediately after the unit was handed the slip of paper with their names on it, indicating they were a unit, they were called into a massive office that they were told belonged to the project head. The name plaque on the door read, Zygmunt Emmermann, Atum.
The god from whom all the others came,
murmured Sienna. The crew entered the office. They were greeted by the sight of the man who had stood in the background during their first briefing. He was tall and imposing, with thick gray hair and impenetrable gray eyes. His very presence commanded a certain degree of terror. It was Kyle who first finally spoke up.
"You summoned us, sir?"
he said in German. Several of the other unit members flinched at his forwardness in the way he spoke to the man.
"Yes,"
Emmerman replied.
"I did. Partly as a congratulations and well wishes for your new unit, as well as a partial briefing. Your unit has been formed for one reason, and one reason only: to combat the greatest enemy to our cause, the Giza Intelligence Group."
The group exchanged confused glances at one another. As if sensing their confusion, Emmerman continued.
Giza Intelligence is an ancient organization, an offshoot of a group known as the Orion Syndicate. You will someday know what that means. Suffice to say, they are the anti-life, opposition to the glory and honor that we all stand for, our greatest enemy.
The group began at that moment, due to the programming they had undergone, to feel a certain righteous indignation, even against this group of individuals they had never heard of just 5 minutes prior to the conversation. Emmerman continued.
For operational security, you 7 are not to interact with your comrades outside of your own unit unless absolutely necessary. And when it is, you're never to divulge any information about your operations. You are to have a policy of 100% secrecy. Am I being understood?
Yes, sir. Sieg Heil.
The unit responded in unison.
Magnificent. Now you may return to your stations. I have a job to continue to do.
Emmerman said. The group dutifully filed out of the office. The next weeks, and eventually months, were spent on training. A particularly notable day was when the IBIS assets were placed into their non-human avatar bodies for the first time. Let us examine in detail this eventful day. The routine had been established that for most of the day, the assets spent the days in their adult bodies, and every night were placed back in their child bodies, and kept overnight in their cages, except for times when they were placed with their pairs as adults overnight in order to reinforce the bond. This day, however, proved different. At the appointed time, Kyle dutifully entered the tank. It was to his great surprise that when he emerged, he realized that he was incredibly tall, and looking down, saw a crocodile humanoid body. He attempted to speak, but found that his new mouth could not form words, only sputtering, growling sounds. Dr. Krieger was standing nearby, observing with a massive grin on her face.
Good. You cannot speak as you have before. Think of the words you wish to say. Don't speak. Just think.
Dr. Krieger instructed.
What the fuck?
Was Kyle's immediate mental reply.
I don't appreciate your language, Sobek. It is uncalled for. You knew this would happen.
Dr. Krieger said in telepathic rebuttal. Almost without meaning to, Kyle whipped the tail on his new avatar body. He barely felt as it collided with the body of one of the technicians and sent him flying several feet. He turned to see it. The man staggered to his feet, trying in vain to brush the coffee off himself that he had spilled and cursing under his breath. From there, Kyle was ushered to yet another previously inaccessible region of the facility, this one a long series of training rooms, gymnasiums, gun ranges, virtual reality training zones, and so on. Kyle noticed as he walked through the hallways in his new God avatar that now people stepped aside in obvious fear. He took a certain pleasure in this, for some understandable reasons. Kyle was escorted into one of the virtual reality rooms. This one, he noticed, had far larger than average chairs, some of which had holes in the back. To accommodate tails, he realized as he awkwardly took a seat. Soon, all other members of Kyle's unit filed in. 2 human technicians followed. One carried a tangle of wires, the other a large black box. The one carrying the wires, a young blonde woman, quickly untangled them. On the ends of each one was an electrode pad. She proceeded to go to each asset and stick the pads on their heads.
Try not to think for a few minutes,
she advised cryptically. Of course, this was not possible. Almost immediately, as the electrodes were connected to each other's heads, the assets were hit with a cacophony of voices, each other's voices. Then just like that, it stopped again. The 2 technicians stood in front of the assets, and one, the young blonde again, spoke.
The electrodes and wires link your brains. The box acts as a filter. Only active and intentional thoughts get through it. Today is an exercise in telepathic cooperation in a combat scenario, when using your voices would be a detriment. We will now attach your virtual reality headsets, and the exercise will commence.
After Kyle's headset had been attached, with some difficulty due to this avatar having a crocodile's head, an image came up on the inside of the goggles portion of the headset. He was greeted by the sight of a large, empty, concrete room with a small table in the center. His other unit members, all in their god avatars, were also present in the room. Against one wall was a table with an assortment of weapons on it, 7 in total. 3 were swords. 1 was a meteor hammer. The rest were battle axes. The group was instructed to approach the table and discuss among themselves, telepathically, who was to receive each weapon. They followed the instructions. It took time to figure out the system, but within 10 minutes Kyle's group had become operational, with each member easily communicating and all of them armed.
Okay.
One of the technicians then said into the comms,
"We're upping the ante. Prepare yourselves."
Without warning, the enormous hangar-style doors to the virtual building opened, and 3 creatures flew in. Kyle looked in horror for several seconds. The creatures looked like green, bloated vampire bats. Their bodies were perhaps 15 feet in length, and their wingspan must have been nearly twice this. And the stench. Kyle's shock broke quickly, however.
Fuck them up,
he commanded telepathically to the unit. He swung his meteor hammer upward, instinctively knowing how to do it somehow. He heard a distinct crack as it collided with the shoulder of one of the monstrosities. With a shriek, the beast crashed to the floor. It got to its feet quickly, however. Roger, one of the sword possessors, charged the beast and rammed his sword into its lower belly, then twisted it and thrust upwards. The abomination's intestines spilled out, and it collapsed. Kyle looked up then to witness Sienna being lifted into the air by another of the bat monsters, which was now leaving the hangar. Her avatar dripped with blood from where the beast's claws had grabbed her. It flew out. One of the other unit members desperately threw an axe but fell short. The creature flew into the digital sky and vanished. Then suddenly, the simulation reset itself. The technician's voice came over the comms again.
"You screwed up. She's dead. Start again."
All of this took place, of course, in far less time than it takes to tell. The exercise was repeated. None of the assets was allowed rest until they had completed the exercise with all 3 monstrosities dead and an intact unit. It took many attempts. Upon completion, the unit was expecting congratulation. This was not to be. They were all put back into their child bodies, then returned to their cages. They were kept in these without food or drink until they were on the verge of death from starvation. Only then were they removed from there. It was at this time that the unit was introduced to regeneration tanks. These tanks were kept in yet another laboratory. In these were another set of cylindrical tanks, much like those their avatars were kept in. These, however, were filled with an opaque white fluid, unlike the translucent green of the avatar tanks. They were subsequently lowered into these. They fell unconscious immediately, but they emerged energized and with all the weight they had lost regained. However, they still felt hunger. The punishment was not yet over, as they were then brought into another lab and fed intravenously. No real food was issued. This exercise was repeated many times. Every time, it took multiple attempts, and for this, the group was punished. As the starvation punishment took time, however, it was replaced with floggings with a leather whip that had metal rivets attached at odd intervals. The group had to count the number of lashes they received, and if they counted wrong, it was started again. Before each flogging, they were injected with drugs so that they would remain conscious for the process. After the floggings, they were placed in the regeneration tanks. The settings on the tanks were altered so that the scars remained, and therefore, every time the unit changed in the locker rooms, at least while in child bodies, they would see the scars and have a constant reminder of their punishments and, of course, why they had been punished. This made them learn very quickly. Soon, once the unit could complete the exercise in a single attempt, several times in a row, the number of bat-like abominations was moved up to 5, then 10, then a new exercise was introduced. For this new exercise, the unit was placed into their adult human avatar forms. Instead of the hangar-like structure they were used to, the unit this time found themselves to now be outdoors. Kyle stared in awe at the landscape surrounding them. No trees, no large hills, no greenery. Just tan sand and brown and tan rocks. It was Kyle's first ever look at a desert. As the crew stood, they were suddenly aware that they were nude.
"Hold still a moment. We're loading in the armor,"
one of the technicians said, as if reading their thoughts. As they stood, an armor did form to cover their bodies. It was white and appeared to be made of some form of metallic material, all except for the part of the helmet which covered the face, which was some type of clear, blue, glass-like polymer. After the armor had formed, the group saw something in the distance. An entire flock of the bat-like monsters was flying towards them.
"Hey, we're fucking unarmed here,"
Joey shouted. Communication was easier in these avatars, since it was now possible to use their voices.
"Hold out your arms,"
was the instruction over the comms. The group did so. As they did, rifles were loaded into their hands. Kyle had the barest familiarity with guns, from his childhood in Königshütte.
"Follow my lead,"
Kyle ordered the unit, and then aimed the gun upward and pulled the trigger. A gush of blue projectiles came out. The other members nodded in understanding. Elsa then fired her gun. However, she failed to take note of what was in her path. Joey stood near her. The projectiles shredded his armor, and his virtual body collapsed. The simulation reset.
First rule when using guns, don't shoot your friends. Start again.
The technician stated flatly. And so the cycle continued. Exercise, repeat until success, then punishments for the failures. The guns in the simulation never required reloading. Soon after, the next phase of training began. The group was called into the makeshift classroom, again in their adult human avatar forms. On each of the desks was a set of guns, a semi-automatic pistol, an assault rifle, a pump shotgun, and a bolt-action rifle. Kramer, the SS man, stood at the front of the room and spoke to the students.
You will all turn your attention to the projection screen behind me. This is a class on the handling of firearms. The film will instruct you. You will follow the directions. As needed, ammunition will be handed out to you.
And so it went. The film instructed on the handling and operation of each type of gun. Kramer made his rounds, handing out each type of ammunition so that the assets could load their weapons. Eventually, they were led to the training area, which contained a gun range where they practiced with their weapons. Eventually, they were taught about field stripping and the repair of guns. Due to the nanites and/or drugs they were given, their learning capabilities were accelerated to an enormous degree. Within perhaps 2 weeks, the assets were able to, while blindfolded, strip their guns, put them back together, and shoot them with alarming accuracy in a span of under 30 seconds. This was followed by training in Chinese martial arts, once again via the virtual reality system. They also received some training in psychic warfare. However, due to limitations in my own memory, this unfortunately cannot be recounted in any detail. The final phase of training was in that of combat medicine. Once again, all the assets were gathered into the makeshift classroom, in their child bodies this time, and shown a film. This one detailed the principles of medical care on the battlefield. After the class had been held, a test was administered. Kyle and Elsa, still in child bodies, were taken to a small room. In it was located a gurney and a low-lying table with all the medical supplies they had recently been familiarized with. Before either of them could guess what was expected of them, a woman in uniform entered the room, produced a pistol, and shot Elsa in the stomach.
She's dying. Pack the wound or cauterize. I estimate you have 3 minutes until she bleeds out. If she's dead when I come back, we do this again.
The officer stated, without a trace of feeling in her voice. The officer left after stating this. Kyle rushed to the door, but found it locked. He felt panic for perhaps 3 seconds. Then, as always, his rationality kicked in again. He ran to the table and assembled quickly all that was needed, somehow forcing himself to ignore Elsa's whimpers. He assembled all the necessary equipment and gave Elsa a shot of morphine, then proceeded to pack the wound. Elsa survived. The exercise was considered to be a success. After the completion of their training, Kyle's unit received a name, the Golden Fleece. All of them, and the rest of the Ibis children, had been at this facility for around a year, when they were assigned their first real mission. This will be described in the next chapter. Author's note. I hope the reader understands I have not recounted every excruciating detail, and could not, anyway, due to memory limitations. Chapter 5. The next incident, within 2 days of the completion of their training, was the Golden Fleece receiving the assignment for their first real-world mission. The Golden Fleece was called into Emmerman's office that day, after tersely congratulating the unit on graduating. He spoke.
Now is the time for you to begin earning your keep. We've shown great generosity in training you to achieve the greatness you're capable of. Now you are to prove that it was worth our hospitality. You are being sent out on your first operation, one of many to come.
He handed Kyle a file and instructed him and the others to take it into the adjoining room. They did so, and found themselves in a fairly typical-looking conference room, and realizing what was expected, sat and strategized. The mission brief was, as the saying goes, deceptively simple. The brief was heavily redacted. No actual names were present. However, it was clear that the unit had the assignment to clear out a group of ETs from the location they were being sent, which was an old and supposedly abandoned prison camp located within the south of Brazil. Before leaving, the Golden Fleece were administered a round of nanites, nominally to eliminate the need for sleep, and they were suited up in the white and blue power armor they had grown used to wearing in the training simulations. They were then escorted out of the base, where they were led by a guard through the warehouse building into an elevator. They traveled upward in it for what felt like ages, covering about a mile in distance. They reached the top, emerging into another warehouse. The outside of this was their first breath of fresh air since their arrival at the Ibis base. The area where the warehouse stood was heavily wooded and clearly of a high elevation. The air was thinner than in the facility, which was obviously pressurized for comfort. The soldiers mostly wore British uniforms indicating the Royal Air Force, interspersed occasionally with Royal Canadian Air Force personnel and a few men of the Canadian Army. They paid no attention to the Ibis soldiers or the SS man who was leading them. They seemed under orders to not take any note of such an unusual sight. The unit was loaded into an Army green Land Rover and driven along a dirt road for perhaps a mile through the woods. They reached a clearing with a most incredible sight, a black triangular craft. It was equilateral, with each side perhaps 100 feet long. It was about 20 feet tall. A ramp lowered from it, leading into the ship itself. A man stood at the top, waving at the Golden Fleece to board.
"We ain't got all fucking day. Let's move out,"
he shouted cheerfully at the visibly stunned unit. With one last glance at each other, they boarded. The craft was sleek on the inside, chrome and white, with smooth tan upholstered benches running along each wall. At the front was a cockpit of sorts, containing 2 seats with a curved screen in front. The Golden Fleece unit took their seats on the benches. The young bright-eyed brunette man who had waved them aboard took one of the seats at the front. The craft lifted, though almost imperceptibly. The movement was so seamless it almost couldn't be felt. It took off flying, and no more than 5 minutes later, it stopped again. It then proceeded to lower to the ground.
"Surely we can't have arrived at our destination yet,"
Sandra Lau/Hathor muttered to herself incredulously. However, sure enough, the craft landed, hovering as it had before about 10 feet from the ground. The ramp lowered again, and the Golden Fleece unit dutifully disembarked as one. They found themselves in a clearing, in an obviously tropical biome. Brightly colored birds flew overhead, singing in a way that the Golden Fleece members were all unfamiliar with. The ship took off again. The unit watched as it jumped, that is, took off at an incredibly high speed, so fast that it was difficult to even see.
Party's over.
Kyle said.
Time to do our jobs.
On each suit of armor, on the wrist, was a touch screen, a wrist-mounted computer of sorts. It displayed a map with a line through it. The map displayed the route to their objective, which lay 3.5 kilometers to the northwest.
That's close enough that the craft might have been observed on approach. We must expect that we've been anticipated.
Kyle observed. The group trod carefully through the jungle to the site. If there had ever been a road, it had long ago been reclaimed by nature. The unit, with their enhancements, easily cut through the foliage that would have taken great effort to a normal person, even with a machete. Eventually they began to hear sounds of life, intelligent life, rather, since the jungle already teemed with the wild variety. Voices, in a language that was clearly not human, could be heard somewhere in the distance. Kyle signaled the unit to be silent. They crept carefully towards the sounds, reaching a clearing eventually, a rusted wire fence surrounding it. Within the fence were perhaps 100 huge wooden longhouse-like barracks buildings, 2 columns of them, separated by a dirt road. A single flag flew above the camp. Kyle zoomed in, as this was a feature of the helmet. The flag was black on the background. On it was printed a gold pyramid with a silver capstone. A comet flew in its front, with its tail reaching behind the pyramid. Kyle zoomed out, having at the time no idea of the significance. I'd like to draw the reader's attention to something notable that occurred next. This was the first time that Kyle questioned orders. It would not be the last. He saw before him not a prison camp, as the brief had said, but a simple barracks. He instinctively knew then that he could not always trust everything his leaders would tell him and those whom he led. Nevertheless, the mission continued. Kyle instructed the group, telepathically, to proceed with a perimeter sweep, keeping themselves concealed in the foliage. They slowly performed it. They were not observed. The camp had no apparent entrance aside from a small gate which was guarded. The group got a good look at the occupiers. They were mostly iguana humanoids, though there were some human-looking persons as well, all blonde and blue-eyed. Kyle took note of several persons pushing what appeared to be oblong wheelbarrows. Kyle then, again telepathically, directed the Golden Fleece to regroup at the back of the compound. They did so. None of them were spotted. At the back of the camp, Joseph produced what appeared to be a small stiletto switchblade, but when the button on the side was clicked, a small blade of plasma, rather than metal, was what popped out. Joseph handed the blade to Kyle, who proceeded to cut a hole in the fence. The blade cut the wire fence as though it was made of butter. The group slipped in undetected and huddled behind one of the barracks. Under Kyle's instruction, they split, each taking a position. Then, without warning, all 7 opened fire. The plasma projectiles shredded the targets. For a few moments, it was a massacre. The Golden Fleece had the total element of surprise. This, of course, did not last. Kyle heard, more than felt, the bullet at his back. The armor barely registered it. He spun and fired a spray of plasma. The humanoid who had shot at him flew back, propelled by the projectiles. However, the shooter had emerged from one of the barracks buildings. All the windows of the building were flooded very quickly with more shooters.
I need cover!
Kyle screamed as he ducked and sprinted to the side. Elsa and Sandra ran to their leader's side and began firing, scattering directions to confuse the shooters. Kyle tossed a grenade through one of the windows while the hostiles were distracted. The explosion ripped a huge hole in the thin wooden wall of the building and sprayed the remains of those it hit. The shooters began to retreat.
Okay, clear the building. Don't fucking let them get away.
Kyle ordered. He and the two assisting him entered the building. Inside, there was a long set of bunks. A wall of them was being rearranged to block the trio from advancing. Kyle raised his gun to fire at the group creating the wall, but Elsa simplified and simply chucked another grenade. The grenades the Golden Fleece used were smokeless, so instantly the three could advance. To their surprise, the building beyond was already empty, and no door was visible.
Where the hell?
Elsa spat out.
They're gone.
As if in answer, Roger's voice came on the comms.
Sobek,
he said, addressing Kyle by his call sign.
There's a fucking tunnel under the buildings. They're running down there. What do we do?
Copy, Horace. All operatives, enter the tunnel. We'll corral them. Fuck them up. We don't fail.
Kyle and his two helpers rushed to the hole in the floor they had spotted, which was hidden again between bunks. They entered. There was a long concrete tunnel ahead of them, with rooms branching off to the sides. Kyle opened fire at the reptile and humanoid beings in the tunnel. Other Golden Fleece unit members entered from the rest of the buildings in the compound. They all began opening fire, from different angles, so as to not hit each other, as they'd been trained. Their targets stood no chance. Some ducked into the rooms branching off of the hallway, but were chased and gunned down. There were no survivors. Eventually, things quieted down somewhat, and the Golden Fleece began to sweep the rooms. They saw a lot of what appeared to be scientific equipment. In one room, Kyle came across what at first glance seemed to be tall barrels covered with a shroud. In spite of Joey objecting, he removed the shroud. To his shock, they were not barrels at all. They were plexiglass tubes, the bottom 20 inches of which were metal with a screen. On the screen was writing, in a language and script that the Golden Fleece members had never seen. In the tubes were humans, all children under the age of 5, and all of them were visibly unconscious. Sandra began to think of shooting off the tops of barrels. However, Kyle, hearing her thoughts, ordered her not to. The children were in stasis, he surmised, and destroying that which was keeping them in stasis would likely kill them. As the brief had instructed, Kyle looked down at his wrist-mounted computer to call back into base. Emmerman's face then appeared on screen.
Mission successful, Sobek?
Emmerman asked.
Mission successful, sir. We found something, however.
Children in stasis pods.
Kyle was taken aback.
Yes, sir. How should we proceed?
Don't. Wait for extraction. Don't touch any equipment either.
Yes, sir. We will wait. All unit members are accounted for.
Very well then. Signing off. And Sobek?
Emmerman said.
Yes, sir.
You've done good work today. Sieg Heil.
Kyle smiled very slightly at the praise, the first he'd received since he'd arrived at the Ibis base.
Thank you, sir. Sieg Heil.
Over and out.
Emmerman said.
Over and out.
Kyle replied, switching off the wrist computer. The crew returned to above ground level, and soon enough, a craft, identical to the one which had brought them to Brazil, arrived and returned them to the Ibis base, with an all-new outlook. They still knew so little, yet now they felt different. They'd had a glimpse at what they now believed was their destinies. Upon their arrival, however, their being in the dark finally changed, or at least lessened. The Golden Fleece and all the other Ibis assets were summoned again to the makeshift classroom. Due to a language barrier, and in the interests of expediency, this will be a paraphrasing of that which followed. First, the members of the Golden Fleece were called to the front and were commended by Emmerman. Then he briefed them all. He seemed to rather lose his sense of formality and spoke to them in a colloquial fashion, code switching between German and English. It was during this briefing that the assets first heard the name of Project Ibis, and finally, its goals. They had all been educated heavily on the ideology of Nazism and the beginning of the war. However, it was here that they learned the outcome. They also first learned that the year was 1973. Kyle was stunned at this revelation, having come from 1944. The goals of the program were then laid out. The ideology was based on human, and particularly Aryan, supremacism. Emmerman explained how, in the Nazi view, Germany and all of Terra had fallen to Semitic alien influence. This influence, Emmerman said, emanated from the Orion Syndicate, a terrorist organization headed by draconian reptile aliens. What draconian reptile aliens meant was not explained at the time. The goals of Ibis, Emmerman specified, was to obliterate this Semitic alien influence by conquest, starting with the Orion Syndicate. The conquest was to be done, in the ultimate irony, by former extraterrestrials, the reincarnations of the gods of old. They were to be crafted into the ultimate weapons of mass destruction, and one day, Emmerman promised, resurrect the Age of Glory, as he had chosen to refer to this mythical past. He ended the meeting with the customary Sieg Heil. The Ibis assets, their indoctrination firmly set in by now, responded in kind. Author's note. I hope the reader will be intrigued and spurred on by this glimpse of real action, finally furthering the narrative of Kyle's life. Chapter 6. I would next like to draw the reader's attention to a series of events that occurred in Vietnam in what I believe was the winter of 1973 to 1974. But first, I will describe the routine that the Ibis assets eventually settled into. Kyle by then, along with the remainder of the Golden Fleece, had grown accustomed to the missions that they were expected to do. Due to limited memory, I can't elaborate on much. These missions were mostly of a nature that involved either assassination or combat. Most were in far-flung corners of Earth. This became the routine of each day. They'd be woken up, having usually spent the nights in their child bodies. They only spent the nights in their adult bodies when they were ordered to do so with their pairs in order to reinforce the bond or when an operation took multiple days. After being woken up, they were served a meal. Each unit had its own table. No interaction of any kind with other assets was at any point ever allowed. After their morning meal, they would be placed in an avatar, either adult human or their god avatars, then called into the makeshift classroom. There would be another indoctrination session, given always by either Kramer or Emmerman. Then the units would be called, each in their turn, into Emmerman's office, be handed their mission brief for the day, then provided with their nanites just before being sent out into the field. The armor they wore in their adult avatar forms used an ingenious system of recycling nutrients in the body that made eating and relieving oneself unnecessary for several days. In their god avatars, the assets were given food to take on the missions, since these avatars wore no armor. Upon their return to base, the assets were given another briefing, explaining a bit of what they'd accomplished, with congratulations from Emmerman in their role in eradicating the Semitic alien threat. They were then served an evening meal, usually meat, then returned to their child bodies and put back in their crib cages for the night. The next day was always a repeat of all that I have described in the above. All this every day for years. Now back to Vietnam. Kyle and Joey were called to Emmerman's office in their child bodies this time, which was unusual, and just the two of them also unusual. Here they were briefed as to their mission. Emmerman explained that he was isolating Kyle and Joey in order to test how two assets would operate in a pair. Since Kyle and Joey's skills seemed the most complementary, he had chosen them as the subjects for use in this particular experiment. I believe I should give a short history lesson on the ET aspect of the Vietnam War and its relationship to Project Ibis. Vietnam was an ET war. Aldebaran, and by extension Project Ibis, adopted a pro-Northern stance and backed Ho Chi Minh's efforts in creating the Socialist Republic of Vietnam in the north, in opposition to the Draco-backed government of the Republic of South Vietnam. Emmerman explained that alien spies had been found infiltrating the territory of North Vietnam and needed to be hunted and brought to a location. The specifics of the location Emmerman did not disclose at the time, nor did he disclose the methods of capture that Kyle and Joey should use, or what they were to do at the location after bringing the persons they had captured to it. Soon enough, now in their adult bodies, Kyle and Joey were escorted to the surface and onto a triangular transport ship, as was the usual procedure. The ship jumped, again as usual, and landed. Kyle and Joey found themselves, for the first time, in what appeared to be a fully functioning airport, albeit a small one, and the ship had landed in a rather well-concealed part of it, away from public view. However, several commercial aircraft could clearly be seen flying overhead. A young Vietnamese man approached Kyle and Joey with an eager smile. He carried a rifle quite unfamiliar to either of the two Ibis assets. He caught them staring at it.
AKM rifle from Russia. Best gun in the world,
the young soldier said to Kyle and Joey, in fluent English.
Oh, pardon me, sir, but do you know who and what we are?
Kyle asked in confusion. How would someone of such an obviously low rank know about assets in a project of such secrecy? And if he did not know, why did he not ask questions? Kyle did not understand people who never seemed to question their orders. The young soldier simply grinned, not answering Kyle's query. Kyle and Joey were then led to a nearby helicopter, a captured Huey by the looks of it. The two boarded it, and the young Vietnamese soldier who had greeted them took the pilot's seat. The co-pilot's seat was already occupied. The helicopter lifted. It flew over the airport, some jungle, and then a city. The pilot turned around and looked at Kyle and Joey, grinning.
Please, look upon my humble hometown.
At the height the helicopter was flying at, Kyle couldn't make out much. However, he could see that the city below was quite beautiful and bustled with life. It surrounded a large lake. It was Hanoi. Kyle could also just make out certain buildings that had been bombed which were being repaired, as well as roads blocked by checkpoints. The obvious war scene reminded him of Königshutte and of the drive out of it, the last time he had seen his home. Another pang of homesickness swept over him. What had become of the fatherland in the intervening decades, Kyle wondered. If Emmerman's propaganda was to be believed, it must be borderline uninhabitable, now that the National Socialists were no longer in power, and it was under American and Semitic or alien control. As the helicopter flew on, the scenery gradually changed from city to jungle, dotted with occasional villages. It was near one of these that the helicopter landed, in a clearing visibly too small for the usual triangle craft, likely the reason that the final leg of the journey had taken place in the helicopter. Upon landing, Kyle and Joey consulted their wrist computers, as was their usual procedure. It laid out the mission brief. Kyle turned to the Vietnamese soldier who had flown them in.
We're here to find non-human combatants. We have reason to suspect that this village is harboring them.
To Kyle's surprise, the young soldier simply nodded, in apparent understanding. Then he, Kyle, and Joey alighted from the helicopter. The co-pilot never so much as glanced at any of them. The trio walked the short distance to the village. Not one soul could be seen on the streets.
Looks like it's abandoned.
Joey remarked.
And yet there's a community garden. It's kept up.
They hid when they heard the helicopter.
The Vietnamese soldier stated in reply.
We go to the biggest house.
The trio walked up to what seemed to be the largest house, a 2-story dwelling with a thatched roof. The 3 men walked in formation so as to have all sides covered in case of an ambush. Upon arriving at the door, Kyle reached up to knock. The Vietnamese soldier passed by him, walking up and simply kicking in the door. A family was huddled inside. A man, 2 women, and 5 children. All the children were under the age of 7. The Vietnamese soldier began shouting orders at the group which Kyle couldn't understand. The children scurried into a corner, and the adults stayed huddled in visible terror. The soldier turned to Kyle.
What am I to say to assist your mission?
Tell them we know they've been assisting the South and that their village is harboring non-human combatants.
The young soldier turned to the group of terrified adults and pointed his AKM rifle at them, speaking in Vietnamese, ordering, Kyle guessed, for them to give up the location. The man and 2 women stayed strong and shook their heads, and the soldier continued demanding.
Fuck this,
Joey muttered. Before Kyle could object, Joey had turned his gun on the group of children.
Okay, enough of this shit. Tell whichever of these women is the mother that if she doesn't own up, I'm going to paint these walls with her little baby's brains.
Joey barked. To relay this message proved unnecessary. One of the women had already stood to her feet and began speaking to the soldier. After a moment, he turned to Kyle and Joey.
She says the non-humans are in a hut just north of here. They're unarmed, she says. She just begs us to not harm her children.
I don't buy it, but we'll go along.
Joey said.
But we're taking one of these little ones along for insurance.
He started to bend down to pick one up. The woman began to scream hysterically and fall to the straw floor.
No, leave the child alone,
Kyle ordered.
Stand down, Konsu. Do you honestly think this woman would lie with the lives of her children threatened? You've done quite enough today.
The trio of Kyle, Joey, and the young soldier left the house and began walking in the direction they'd been instructed.
Konsu,
Kyle said to Joey once they were out of sight of the house.
Will you come here, please?
Joey did so. Without warning, Kyle punched Joey in the mouth.
I am your unit leader. You circumvented my authority. I might overlook that, but what I will not overlook is that you threatened a life of a child. We are the Golden Fleece. That is not how we operate.
Kyle yelled in rage. After recovering from being punched in the mouth, Joey spoke.
It worked, didn't it? Got the intel.
It worked, didn't it? That's all you have to say. Gods, you sound like a fucking Semite. You disgust me, Khonsu. Keep your mouth shut until I tell you otherwise. Now that's an order.
Kyle barked. Soon enough, the trio approached the hut they'd been directed to. It was like those in the village they'd just left, bamboo and with a thatched roof. As before, the Vietnamese soldier kicked in the door. Inside, the trio of men were instantly met with a terrible stench. Then the sight of several aliens. These aliens, 7 in total, all fit the definition of what are known as tall greys. They were perhaps 7 feet tall and shiny, with gray skin and solid black eyes on their noseless faces. 4 of the aliens had weapons in easy reach and began to grab them. Kyle, Joey, and the Vietnamese soldier opened fire and dropped the 4 greys. A 5th one improvised, grabbing a chair and raising it with a shriek. It was gunned down as well. Kyle turned to the remaining 2 aliens and gave them a telepathic message.
Put your hands up, calm the fuck down, and no one else needs to die.
The aliens obeyed this command.
They're malleable,
Kyle realized.
They obey whoever is the strongest in the room. We can use that.
The 2 greys, now prisoners, were led out of the hut at gunpoint. The trio of soldiers with their prisoners marched through the village, intending to make a display. However, none of the residents emerged from their homes, and the group reached their transport unmolested. Upon reaching the helicopter and loading in their prisoners, the Vietnamese soldier and the co-pilot broke into an argument. Kyle guessed over the stench of the new passengers. It ended with the pilot barking an order, the co-pilot shut up, and then the flight began. Since the helicopter only accommodated 2 passengers, the 2 greys were forced to lay on the floor. This flight was longer than the first. It took them over seemingly endless jungles to their destination. As they approached, they were informed by the pilot that they were rapidly approaching the Chinese border, and therefore had to fly low. Eventually, they reached their destination. It was a clearing in a valley and surrounded by nothing visible for tens of miles. There was nothing in that clearing except 2 bamboo huts, much like the ones in the village they had just left. Between them was a helipad. That was all, at least on the surface.
This is it? This is where we've been sent?
Kyle wondered aloud. Almost immediately, 2 Vietnamese men, both in black power armor similar to that which Kyle and Joey were wearing, emerged from one of the huts. They opened one of the back doors to the helicopter and pulled out the 2 greys. The greys offered no resistance as they were dragged out, laid on the ground, and tightly hogtied with strips of leather. Then each soldier slung a tied alien over his shoulder like a rug and marched back to the hut. They never paid Kyle or Joey the least attention. As the armor-clad men walked away, Kyle and Joey were alerted by a knock on the helicopter opposite that which the aliens had been unloaded from. Kyle looked over to see a young woman in a green uniform with a black skirt was the one knocking. He noticed that she was very pretty and blonde. He opened the helicopter door to her. She motioned for Kyle and Joey to exit.
Welcome, gentlemen, to the Ho Chi Minh Center for the Internment of Invasive Biologicals. I am Officer Margaret Huppner. Most people here call me by my call sign of Skylark, or Feldlerke in German, if you prefer. I am your new hostess,
she said, with a noticeable Viennese accent.
I think I like the looks of this place already,
Kyle remarked, not even trying to hide the way he was surveying the young woman's every inch. Skylark grinned very slightly, but her businesslike nature remained totally unbroken.
I will show you the facility now, gents, then show you to your quarters,
she said tersely. She turned to walk towards the hut opposite the one that the two soldiers had dragged the two aliens into. Kyle and Joey followed closely behind. They were met with a rather remarkable sight upon entering the hut. The bamboo and thatched roof was simply a facade. The walls inside were concrete. The room was taken up mostly by what appeared to be a massive industrial cage elevator. Above the door to enter it was a red metal plate, with the words, "Employees and Visitors, Entrance Only," printed on it in black script, in English, German, Vietnamese, and then, finally, French. The elevator was guarded by a man who appeared to be an alien. He was 14 feet tall, humanoid-shaped yet feline, and had blue and black fur in a tiger pattern. Kyle asked the guard a question telepathically.
They allow non-humans to guard a facility made to imprison them?
He had guessed that this was what was meant by the invasive biologicals portion of the name for this facility.
I am human. My name is David, but adapted through genetics. If you feel you simply must know.
The guard replied into Kyle's mind. It was clear he'd received the question before and had come to find it offensive. Officer Hupner stood next to the gate to the elevator and used the retinal scanner that was there. The gate opened, and she entered. The gate closed instantly behind her.
Please use the retinal scanner, gentlemen,
she said. Kyle did so. To his surprise, it seemed he was already in the registry. The data for this to be necessary must have been sent to the system at this facility from the IBIS base. It was his first awareness of any kind of network. The elevator then began to descend. It went down quite a long distance in a mostly rock shaft. They were descending to the inside of the earth. Eventually, it reached the bottom of the shaft. Upon exiting the elevator, Kyle and Joey were met with a truly remarkable sight. They were on a balcony, ring-shaped, around the inside of a structure, a tremendous panopticon. The other side of this level, straight across, must be over a mile across, Kyle realized. He looked down. There were numerous levels of equal size, reaching down even further into the bowels of the earth. In the center was a tower, with a single circular glass room on the top of it, which was level with the ring that Kyle, Joey, and Skylark stood on, though there was clearly no access to this room from anywhere except by ascending the tower it was placed on.
37 levels,
Skylark said.
This top level is the administrative ring. The one directly below us is housing for administrators and guards. The remaining 35 levels are a prison for, as you have likely guessed, non-humans illegally on this planet. This facility is in the panopticon style to make escapes near impossible, since ascending or descending the levels is impossible to do without being seen.
Skylark then proceeded to lead Kyle and Joey a short distance around the ring, to an office with the words "Visitors Registration" above the door, in the same 4 languages that had been at the entrance above ground. Inside it looked very conventional. Just a large all-white waiting room, with a reception desk manned by a young Vietnamese woman. The normality of the space was quite incongruous with the steely futurism of the facility it was placed in, Kyle thought. The receptionist stood and handed Kyle and Joey each a clipboard with a single piece of paper on it.
Sign the dotted line, and then Officer Hupner can see you on your way,
the receptionist instructed tersely. No sooner had they done so than an alarm sounded, very similar to a civil defense alarm. It sounded in 3 bursts. Kyle turned to see a gate lower itself from the ceiling, blocking the door. Skylark sighed.
That's a containment breach. Probably a drill, but I must report to my station. Sarah here will take care of you gentlemen until I return,
she said. The receptionist, obviously the Sarah she had referred to, simply nodded.
Hurry back. I should like to see more of you,
Kyle said, flirtatiously. Sarah pressed a button on her desk, and the gate that had lowered to block the door lifted for long enough for Skylark to exit the room, clearly perturbed at the inconvenience.
Fuck me,
Kyle heard her mutter as she began to hurriedly walk away from the other side of the gate.
Gladly,
he thought to himself.
Only hope that I get the chance to do so.
Kyle and Joey took seats on the floor of the waiting room, since their power armor was too large for the seats provided. Neither spoke. Joey was still following Kyle's order to remain silent. Eventually, Kyle became aware of music coming through the speaker system, the first music he had heard since leaving Königshütte. It was singing in what he recognized as various Chinese languages. He stood up.
Excuse me,
he said, addressing Sarah, the receptionist.
Where are we hearing this music from?
Hong Kong radio,
she replied.
One of our technicians boosted our connection so we could listen. They have all of the good music. I suppose you hadn't heard?
No,
Kyle replied.
I've been decidedly quite isolated for the past couple of years.
He retook his seat on the floor and listened to the angelic young voice as it wafted through the speaker system. Listening to the words, Kyle felt a calmness wash over his body. This would certainly not prove to be his last foray into the musical field. Soon enough, the lockdown lifted and the gate that had lowered over the door retracted into the ceiling. A few moments later, Officer Hopner re-entered the room.
Merely a drill, as I suspected,
she said, still visibly annoyed by it. Kyle and Joey got to their feet and followed her out of the room. She led them a good distance around the upper level of the panopticon to yet another elevator. They went down 1 level this time. Then they walked another long distance around the ring to a section of rooms labeled Visitors' Quarters. Skylark let Joey into his room first, then Kyle into his. Seeing an opportunity, he invited her into the room with him, under the pretense of showing him what was what. Skylark obviously guessed his intention as she wheeled to face him once the door was shut.
This isn't really how these things are done,
she said. Kyle drew her in and kissed her passionately on the neck.
And why not?
He asked afterward as he began undressing from his armor. A back and forth followed, and then an interlude which both Kyle and Skylark found quite pleasurable came after it, which I will allow the reader to fill in using their own imaginations. After both parties were satisfied, and Skylark had dressed and left the room, visibly slightly embarrassed, Kyle then thought of Elsa. He wondered if she'd be jealous. A naive thought, but then the reader must recall that Kyle was still totally inexperienced with life, and this was his first sexual experience with a woman of his own choosing, and certainly his first that had not been spurred on by a combination of drugs and nanotechnology. He soon explored the room. It proved to be quite depressing. It resembled a rather small windowless hotel room. Its walls were avocado green, and its carpet a bizarre shade of mauve. It had a very small ensuite bathroom, so small that one could not take a shower without then also drenching the toilet. As he was exploring the room, He heard beeping. He soon realized it was coming from the intercom next to his door. He pressed the only button on it.
Yes?
He asked.
You have a call coming in.
A young man's voice said.
Please exit your room.
I have a device for those things.
Kyle replied.
You're referring to your wrist computer. The signal will not reach this far underground. Please exit your room.
Kyle redressed in his armor, the only clothes he had. He exited to find a young American man waiting outside his room, visibly quite annoyed at the wait. Joey was also waiting there. The young American marched them back to the elevator they had arrived at the level in, and then once back on the administrative level, to a large empty conference room with a lone computer monitor placed on the desk. Emmerman was visible on the monitor, obviously the person who was contacting Kyle and Joey. The American merely gestured towards the monitor, then turned around and wordlessly left. Kyle sat, ordering Joey to remain to the side until he was called for. He was still punishing Joey for the incident in the village that day.
Hello, sir. I hope things are well.
Kyle said.
Thank you, Sobek. I trust your mission was a success?
Yes, sir. Apart from some insubordination on behalf of Konsu, our mission was a success. We've been settling in. What are our instructions?
They keep tight hours in that facility. Rest until they fetch you. I want those individuals you picked up to be interrogated. Find out the location of the cell they represent. The rest is need to know, and you and Konsu don't.
Will do, sir. Now about Konsu.
Your report can wait until you have returned, Sobek.
Emmerman interrupted.
This operation takes precedence. Over and out. Sieg Heil, Sobek.
Yes, sir. Sieg Heil.
Kyle said. Kyle and Joey were brought back to their rooms, with seemingly no more information than when they'd been called out. Kyle had begun to notice that Emmerman did things of this nature, simply to remind his assets that he controlled them. Exhausted by the day, Kyle nearly fell into his bed after undressing, and slept more soundly than he perhaps ever had done in his life. It was his first night, spent neither in the war zone where he was born, nor in his crib cage at the Ibis base. He was awoken from his slumber by an insufferable buzzing and wailing sound from the intercom. He pressed the button and was met with a recording saying to get dressed and exit your quarters, in the same languages that seemed to be standard in this facility. He followed the instructions dutifully. He exited his room to find Skylark standing outside, along with Joey. Skylark winked at Kyle, a gesture he did not quite understand, then proceeded to lead him and Joey around the level of the panopticon. To his surprise, they did not stop at the usual elevator, but continued around to a cage elevator.
Gentlemen, please turn your attentions outward. We are descending, and you are being given a high-speed tour.
Skylark instructed. The elevator began to descend, and Skylark began to narrate.
This is the Ho Chi Minh Center for the Internment of Invasive Biologicals, Terra's largest holding facility for extraterrestrial prisoners, capable of holding up to 1 million inmates. Founded in 1945, during the Japanese occupation of Vietnam. You may notice a few things as we descend. First, you will notice that our ceilings vary in height. This is to accommodate even the largest of prisoners, with minimal comfort. Our largest prisoner currently is 10 meters tall. You will also see that levels 11 and 12 are entirely made up of tanks. These are to accommodate our aquatic prisoners. Our cells are all sealed with electromagnetic fields to prevent telepathic waves from escaping. We take a low-tech approach to security otherwise, since computers can be psionically hacked. Now, we have arrived.
The trio exited the elevator on the bottom level. Kyle looked up now in amazement at the 37 levels above. The scale of the place made it seem almost impossible that it could have been built by Terran humans, or anything like them. Or had they built it at all? He felt a chill then, at the idea that aliens would build a prison for their own kind. He had no concept yet of alien politics being as complicated as ours. He still had the monolithic impression of non-humans he had been fed. Skylark led Kyle and Joey to a room. All the rooms on this level had steel doors and no windows.
These rooms are for interrogations,
Skylark explained.
Your prisoners are located in this room.
She stopped in front of the room that was labeled as ISAC-3, used the retinal scanner, and the huge steel door swung open, revealing a cavernous room that was nearly pitch black.
I will stand guard out here. You gentlemen may enter and interrogate your subjects,
she said. They entered. Their eyes, no doubt assisted by their nanites, adjusted to the extreme darkness. The room was vast. On either side, the two greys that Kyle and Joey had arrested were hanging from the ceiling by their wrists. Along one wall was a metal shelf that, on examination, was home to a number of torture implements, small saws, spiked whips, and several electronic devices, the exact uses of which were not clear. In the corner was a box with a red dial that had 2 wires with oversized alligator clamps on the end. An electroshock torture device, Kyle realized.
Okay, fellas,
Joey said, addressing one of the greys.
This can be either easy or difficult. Where is the location of the cell you represent?
Kyle went into the head of the grey standing nearest him. He found no answer. Joey shook his head and produced his small retractable plasma knife and, without warning, cut the grey. It shrieked. Kyle caught a glimpse of thought this time, but to his bewilderment, the thought simply left the head of the grey. Then he had an inspiration.
Konsu, repeat that on the other subject,
Kyle instructed. Joey did so. As Kyle had suspected, the same process repeated. No thought at all on the initial question. Then when the torture was done, a flash of thought, which was then purged.
These specimens share a hive mind of sorts,
Kyle stated.
We must isolate them. Skylark said specifically that the rooms here are made to block telepathic communication.
Kyle went and opened the door of the interrogation chamber.
We need one of these fuckers removed,
he requested to Skylark.
Please have that done.
Skylark rolled up her sleeve, revealing a digital wristwatch. She simply pressed a button on the side of it, and within moments, 2 soldiers had come down on one of the elevators. One was very tall, muscular, and blonde, obviously Germanic. The other was a small and wiry Vietnamese man. Kyle couldn't help chuckling very slightly at the size difference. He instructed the 2 guards to remove one of the aliens. They did so without ever speaking a word, and Kyle never saw them again. Now the process of interrogation was carried out on the remaining grey. It once again tried to purge its mind by transferring to its compatriot, but to no avail. The seal on the room contained its thoughts quite effectively. At this, the grey attempted to override its thoughts with other new thoughts. But Kyle had caught on already. This creature was not built to preserve itself. It was built to preserve a hive mind of information at the cost of itself. A flood of revealing images and words ran through its mind, telling Kyle and Joey everything.
10 clicks west of Tan Ho village in Quang Binh province. That's where the cell is operating from,
Kyle said.
It's another fucking syndicate cell.
Kyle insisted on probing deeper, milking every detail of the location so it could be found by satellite imagery. It took a while, and the gray was left covered in cauterized cuts from Joey's plasma blade, which he applied at even the slightest sign of resistance on behalf of the prisoner. Kyle and Joey left the interrogation chamber well satisfied. Upon exiting, Skylark led the two men back up to the administrative level and into yet another room that she called the map room. A Vietnamese man, obviously a general, greeted them. He never stated his name. Kyle supposed this was another example of needing to know. In the center of the room, the only object present was a huge table. Its top looked to be a single large white light. Skylark reached under the table. Kyle heard the click of a button, and to his surprise, a holographic map appeared across the tabletop.
On the side of the table is an interface, shaped like a handprint. Sobek, lay your hand on it.
The Vietnamese general instructed.
Then, envision in your head the location, while also thinking of the names and directions to it given to you.
It took Kyle several minutes to get the hang of layering all these thoughts, but when he did, a holographic image appeared on the top of the table, a 3D satellite image of the exact spot, nestled in a tight valley of thick jungle. He supposed there must be an entrance to the underground there, and this was the home of the syndicate cell being sought after. In one corner of the hologram were a set of coordinates.
Splendid. You have done well, Sobek and Khonsu. Emmerman will be pleased indeed at this outcome,
the general said, producing from somewhere a clipboard onto which he was writing down the coordinates.
So,
Kyle realized,
this experiment has been planned by multiple people wanting an outcome.
Aloud, he contended,
Sir, may I ask what now? What is to become of this cell, based on the information we have?
You may ask all you wish, Sobek, but you'll receive no answer. The exercise was a success. You and your underling will be returned to your quarters while I inform Emmerman, as well as a few other things. Then you will be returned to Canada,
was his curt reply. Skylark escorted Kyle and Joey back to their rooms.
Do you think I'll ever see you again?
She asked Kyle as she opened his door. Kyle sensed an opportunity. He grabbed Skylark's collar and pulled her into the room, firmly, but not forcefully.
Who knows? Let's make our goodbye worthwhile,
he said. And so they certainly did. As it happened, he never did see Skylark again. She left right after the interlude, and when Kyle and Joey were escorted off base, it was by a middle-aged Vietnamese man they had never seen. They went by helicopter back to where they had arrived, the landing pad at Hanoi Airport, then by their usual triangle ship on the return to the Ibis base in Canada. Their mission was deemed a success by Emmerman, but what became of the intel they had gathered, we are unlikely to ever know. Author's note. The song recounted, Yue Liang Dai Biao, is a classic that I recommend the reader listen to. I tried my best to describe a panopticon, not easy to do with words, so I suggest the reader look it up on their preferred search engine. Chapter 7. The next mission of note, which I can remember, happened on a fateful day in late 1974. This was the first operation that the Golden Fleece ever carried out while in alien avatar form. End of Part 1.